Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater. That's a mouthful. What do most people call you?
Most people call me Jeff, and that's what I prefer, Steve. Thanks. Good to be with you.
I probably will call you Mr. Atwater. During the 2012 legislative session, probably the highest profile insurance issue has been personal injury protection insurance for people who drive automobiles. And it was originally developed during the no-fault environment. And it sounds like a great idea, but it's apparently turned into a great problem. You and the governor particularly want to do something about the fraud involved. Talk to us about it. What is really the problem?
Absolutely, and thank you for positioning that way, Steve, because the governor, Governor Scott, myself, we are all over this issue. The only centerpiece of this conversation needs to be the Florida driver, the Florida consumer. They are being thrown to the wolves with the cost of this coverage, and it's mandated by their government. And what the case is there is tremendous fraud and there are abuses of the present system. And they both have to be dealt with. And so what you have is, over the last 5 years in Florida, traffic accidents are actually down 12%. So you would naturally think, well, then premiums should be coming down because there aren't any new Florida drivers, about a 1% increase in drivers. But what's happening is there is so much cash available in the system that clinics have established themselves, and aren't real clinics. And under the Florida no-fault system, you can go to a variety of providers of services that may or may not have serious credentials that they put at risk by committing fraud. And this is how our system works. So we are now #1 in the country in staged auto accidents. Tampa #1, Miami #2, Orlando #3, and Hialeah is #8 in the country. So 4 of the top 10 cities in the country for fraud staged accidents are in Florida.
And Let me interrupt you for a second. You talk about staged accidents.
Right.
You and the governor actually went out to Pat Thomas Law Enforcement Academy, where state troopers are trained, and watched some staged accidents. Tell me about how that worked.
What they wanted to provide so that they could make it available to fellow Floridians is be on the lookout. If you were involved in an accident like this, it may not have been an accident at all. They showed us how individuals will come up to a stop sign and one will start to wave you through, the perpetrator of the crime and the fraud. You start to move and then they'll hit you right in the side. You explain that to the police officer and the police officer is going to know, let's go check this guy out. Has he been involved in other of these types of accidents? Has that car been in other accidents? That it probably wasn't an accident at all. It was an intentional effort to get you to go out in the intersection so that they could hit you and start the cash flow. So what they do is they put a number of individuals in that vehicle. They cause the accident intentionally, or they do it between two people knowing that they're just only creating a fraudulent accident, and off they go to the clinics and they start billing the insurance company for claims that were never real. And the insurance companies have 30 days to pay the claim, and if they don't, they're going to be involved in a lawsuit. They're making decisions that they ought to just pay these claims. They can't keep up with the fraud fast enough. And so the legislation this year is to deal with these kinds of issues because these rates go up every 6 months. The insurance commissioner sees the losses that the insurance company is suffering. The insurance company says, we believe it's fraud, but we can't fight it fast enough. I'm arresting people as fast as I can arrest, as you know. I have the fraud investigating team. I had a record year of arrests, so nearly 300 arrests just this past year, about 400 in my 12 months now in office. Record numbers of arrests, but there is so much cash in the system you can't arrest these individuals fast enough.
So what needs to be done really to stop it?
There it is. Well, there are some people who believe that we can't fix the PIP system. I'd like to believe we can because, as you mentioned, it has its merits and its value. You have to go after several elements here. One is the provider network. You and I, in our particular healthcare policies, probably don't have access to the kinds of things we make available inside PIP. And so, for instance, you can go to virtually any type of provider, whether it's massage therapist, acupuncturist, other types of medical care such as cold pack, hot packs, and these types of clinics will just run the cost all out of the policy. You've never even seen a physician to say whether or not that therapy would be appropriate for you. And so our goal by the legislation is to say, hold, time out. It's not that there aren't reputable individuals in those types of industries. There are, and they're in every other state as well. But in no other state does the policy provide you to go first to that individual for that type of care. So the legislation this year is looking at, go see a physician. And if a physician says, you know what, this is a soft tissue injury, it's not a broken bone, you go to this type of therapy. And you can go this many times. And then if you're not back on your feet by that time, come see me as your MD licensed or DO licensed physician. And that's, if we don't have a gatekeeper, Steve, this money is just going to continue to run out of the system.
Talk a little bit about a related problem. It may be even bigger than hard fraud. Talk about soft fraud in this system.
Right.
What is that?
Well, somewhat of what we just covered. The staged auto accident is real fraud, and when we contract that back to the individual, and we have a $25,000 reward, and we have been giving out the reward for people who will actually been invited to participate in these, but instead they call us, and so we hope more Floridians will call us when they've been invited to participate in the fraud. But those are real and those are significant. Those staged auto accident. What happens as well is what we call the abuses of the system, the overutilization of the system, and that is someone is in a legitimate accident, but they seem to feel fine, but they are hounded by individuals who have these clinics and say, you need to get in here, you need to get some care. The individual will go ahead and go in for a certain type of care. They'll find out only later that that clinic has billed their entire policy for the limits. So that individual may have made one visit, Steve, but that clinic will bill for 25 and 30 visits that the individual never came for. That's an abuse of the system. It is really fraud, but it's just hard to catch.
In the case of pill mills, this reminds me of the discussion of pill mills,
Right.
where you could probably identify in most of the communities
Right.
where the pills were being prescribed.
Right.
And they even, in some cases, had security guards outside of these. Are we at a point where there are certain places who are doing business this way you could almost identify in certain communities? And do we have the means through laws and so forth to go after those people?
Well, you know what? That's an excellent point, because this part of this legislation as well will be to offer our department more investigators so that we can do this more often. But the sheriff's office, the state attorney's office, we are locating, identifying those places. But in the end, here's what it comes down to. The average 40-year-old in Florida with a perfect driving record, with fewer car accidents, perfect driving record. In the last 2 years, in Jacksonville, Florida, their rates went up 50%. In Orlando, 60%. In Miami, 80%. In Tampa Bay, 81%. In Lake City, 73%. In Fort Myers, 61%. Those are actual increases in premiums with fewer car accidents. You have to keep going back. Can the legislature allow the citizens they represent to be taken to the cleaners? The answer has to be no. They have 8 days left to solve this problem, and I really believe they're going to do it.
All right, let's talk about another question right off, kind of out of the blue.
Sure.
You've been in this job now a little over a year. Has there been a big surprise that has said, wow, I didn't really realize this? Has it been something that really just caught you and you said, didn't know about that?
Well, I want to admit something to you. There is something that has caught my eye, and that is that even as a former legislator that helped construct budgets for $70 billion to serve the people of Florida out of their very money, their precious resource, to reallocate in ways to keep them safe, educate their children, and maintain quality of health in this state. What has surprised me is that the number of dollars deployed every year in the form of a contract. So most of our citizens of Florida just assume their taxpayer covers the highway patrol officer, and it does, the teacher, and it does. But almost 60% of the entire state budget goes to a private vendor to provide a service that the legislature believes is necessary.
Let me interrupt you. You just said what?
60% of the budget, or this year, $51 billion, will not be directly paid to a state employee to deliver a service, or that will be paid for a state vehicle. It will be paid to a private vendor to deliver a warm meal, provide mental health counseling,
60%.
to provide 60%, over $50 billion every year, which gets to your point. What was the aha moment? Is how well are these contracts written? Are the people of Florida getting exactly what they're paying for? And I would tell you, there is tremendous opportunity for improvement.
Okay, let's talk about some of those areas for improvement. You would think that any contract would have certain criteria that you would look at if you were going to hold a contractor accountable. What would some of those criteria be?
Well, and then you would be shocked that that's not the case. That's exactly what I think you would think, and any private business owner would say before we allocate dollars to a vendor, we're going to lay out exactly what we expect, and no matter whether it's my maintenance department or whether or not it's my sales department, they're going to have basic elements in every contract so that we know what we're going to get, what we pay for. And those would be things like, are there clearly defined deliverables that are going to be delivered by that vendor to us? Are there performance measures so I know what I'm getting? Are there fiscal consequences that someone will pay a price if we don't get what we're paying for? You would think those would be in every contract, but there is no place in state law that outlines, no matter whether you're in the Department of Transportation, Department of Health, Department of Education, that you have to have these baseline requirements. And so our hope is that we can work over time now to establish those, so that not to be looking over someone's shoulder. Education department knows what vendors are the book vendors who provide the textbooks, and that's not my job as your CFO. But my job as your CFO is that once we write that check, we better get exactly what we paid for.
Well, you know, with all due respect, you've identified something, I think, that is at the heart of the loss of faith of so many people in government.
That's right.
They feel that no one really is looking
That's right.
at whether or not
That's right.
government is overseeing the expenditure of so much money. And
That's right.
there's so much cynicism about that. There's so much of a feeling of government waste.
Right.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, there's not a lot sometimes of oversight. Maybe there's some, maybe there's a good deal, but you're saying that in terms of absolutely simple business practices, there's not a uniformity, there's not a basic set of requirements.
Steve, that's the point. There's not a state worker that I've met that isn't committed to doing the best they can by the people of Florida, that does the best they can at their job. But if you take this anywhere else in the private sector, that you're not going to create an environment where there can be the occasions or the absence of good practices. And that's all that we're talking about here. And so I cannot sit by as the individual responsible for the people of Florida to settle all claims against the state and write my name on the check when I'm looking at a contract, and here would be a particular example. We had an institution in Florida run by the state that contracted for a certain number of warm meals per bed. And you would think, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, Steve, if I were to tell you that historically the institution was only 30% occupied, you wouldn't stand for a second to have 3 warm meals a day paid for the empty beds. But that's what a contract created. And you say, how could it possibly be that someone in the state signed a contract to pay for warm meals for beds that aren't occupied? The meals never came, but we still had to pay the vendor for the warm meal. That is unacceptable. To your point, the people of Florida have an expectation that when we set up a contract with somebody, we play hardball. We would do just what any other private enterprise would do and say, you're going to deliver this on that day for that price, and if you don't, you're held accountable. We're not writing you a check. And I think that's what I look forward to getting further down the road here in Florida.